In the fall of 1980, a nervous first-year student named Robert Shafran drove up to Sullivan County Community College in the Catskills, parked, and walked into a welcome he could not explain. Students he had never met were grinning at him across the quad. Young men he had never seen clapped him on the shoulder and told him it was good to have him back. A girl walked straight up and kissed him on the cheek. All morning, in the hallways and the dorms and the cafeteria line, people called him by a name that was not his. They kept calling him Eddy. He was 18 years old, from Scarsdale, and he had never set foot on that campus in his life. So he did the thing a friendly kid does when the whole world seems glad to see him. He smiled, and he played along, and he waited for it to make sense. Then one student stopped cold in the middle of the hallway, stared at his face, and went pale. The young man asked him a careful question. "Were you adopted?" Shafran said yes. The student asked the second question, the one that cracked the floor open. "Was your birthday in 1961? Shafran said yes again, and the student said the name Eddy Galland, and said that Eddy had the exact same face, and that Eddy had left the college months ago. Here is the part that should stop you. The question that would take years to surface had nothing to do with luck. It was whether someone had arranged the whole thing, split these lives apart on purpose, and quietly kept them that way. What felt like the single luckiest accident in America, two strangers, with one face colliding by chance in a college hallway, may not have been an accident at all. Underneath the coincidence ran something quiet and deliberate, the reason there were two boys with one face in the first place, and the reason nobody was ever supposed to notice. 3 infants, 3 separate families, and not one of those families had ever known the others existed. That night, another student, a friend of Eddy Galland, named Michael Domnitz, did the math faster than anyone. He tracked Shafran down, told him the two of them had to drive to Long Island right now, and put him in a car. They drove to New Hyde Park in the dark. Galland opened his front door, and the 2 young men stood on the step, staring at a mirror that breathed. Same jaw, same hair, same hands, same wide, stunned grin, spreading across 2 faces at once. They stayed up all night comparing everything. The birthday, the adoption, the agency, and they decided they were twins, separated as babies, and reunited by a miracle. They were wrong. They were short by 1. A few days later, the local papers ran the story. Because a story like that sells itself. 2 identical teenagers, adopted apart, found each other at a community college. The photograph showed both faces side by side. And in Queens, a young man named David Kellman picked up that paper, looked at the picture, and felt the ground tilt. He was not looking at 2 strangers. He was looking at his own face, printed twice. He called the Galland house. Eddy's mother answered, heard his voice, and nearly dropped the phone, because it was the same voice. Kellman said the sentence that turned a miracle into something stranger. He said, "I think I am the third." They were triplets. 3 identical brothers, born in 1961, split up as infants, and scattered across the New York area into 3 different homes. And for 19 years, none of them had any idea the other 2 were walking around with his face. What happened next was a kind of national delirium, and it is worth sitting inside it for a minute, because the joy is what makes the rest so hard. The 3 of them together were electric. They finished each other's sentences. They lit their cigarettes the same way, tilted their heads the same way, laughed the same laugh at the same beat. Reporters could not get enough. The brothers went on the morning shows and the talk shows, 3 grinning young men in a row, and audiences wept. They landed in People magazine. They even turned up on screen for a moment in a Madonna film, a wink at how famous their faces had briefly become. For a while in the early 1980s, the identical triplets from New York were something close to celebrities. And they leaned into it, because why would you not? They were teenagers who had won a lottery nobody else could even enter. They would sit 3 across on a studio couch and finish each other's thoughts for a laughing audience, and the whole country got to enjoy the warm, uncomplicated wonder of it. Nobody was asking hard questions in those first years. The story was too good, and the brothers were too happy, and the thing buried underneath the story had been hidden so well that not even the people living on top of it could feel its shape yet. And underneath the delight ran a deeper fascination, the one that made scientists and talk show hosts lean in at the same angle. If 3 men raised in 3 different houses, by 3 different sets of parents, still turned out this alike, then what did that say about the rest of us? The brothers became a living argument in the oldest debate in psychology: nature versus nurture. Are we written mostly by our genes, or mostly by the homes and the parents and the streets that raise us? Three identical strangers, reared apart and turning out uncannily the same, felt like a clean answer. Genes win. The audience loved that answer. It is simple, and it is a little bit magical, and it let everyone go home, believing something tidy about where people come from. And the similarities really were uncanny, past anything a talk show needed to exaggerate. The brothers found that they gestured alike, that they were drawn to the same kinds of women, that they held a cigarette at the same angle and put it out the same way. They described falling into an ease with each other that none of them had ever felt with anyone, as if some part of each of them had been waiting 19 years to be finished. To the brothers, that ease felt like proof of a bond. The people who had been quietly watching them for years saw it as something else. To them it was a result, a small confirmation that the thing they had been measuring in private actually worked. And not one person in that laughing television audience yet knew there were researchers in the story at all. The brothers loved it too. They moved in together. They opened a restaurant in Manhattan called Triplets, a Romanian steakhouse where the whole draw was the three matching faces working the room. They were young, they were famous, they had each found two brothers they never knew they had. For a moment, it really was the fairy tale the papers promised. But there was one question the fairy tale never answered, and it sat there the whole time like a stone in a shoe. Why were they separated in the first place? Think about it from the parents' side. Three sets of adoptive parents had walked into the same respected adoption agency in New York, the Louise Wise Services, the most prominent Jewish adoption agency in the city. Each couple had come home with a baby boy. Not one of them had been told that their baby was one of three. Not one had been offered the chance to take all three, or even two. And when the reunion hit the papers, the parents started asking the obvious thing. How does an agency split up identical triplets and say nothing? What kind of policy does that? So the three couples went to Louise Wise together and asked. And the answer they got back is the first crack in the fairy tale. The agency told them, in effect, that it was simply easier to place the children one at a time. That finding a single home willing to take 3 infants at once was hard, so the babies had been placed separately, for practical reasons. Nothing sinister, just logistics. And maybe you could believe that, for a second, if it were not for what one of the fathers reportedly saw on his way out. As the families told the story later, after the meeting broke up, Shafran's father realized he had left his umbrella behind and went back to get it. And when he stepped back toward the room, he found the agency's board members opening a bottle of champagne, celebrating. As the families understood it, the people who ran that agency were relieved that the parents had asked their questions and gone home, relieved that whatever they had been sitting on had not come out. That detail comes from the brothers and their families, not from a document, but it reframed everything for them. Because you do not pop champagne over a logistics problem. You pop champagne when you have dodged something. For the parents, that was the moment the warmth curdled. These were not careless people. They were mothers and fathers who had wanted children badly enough to go to an agency, fill out the forms, and open their homes. They had been told they were getting a son. What they slowly understood, standing in that office, was that their family had been arranged. That the most intimate decision of their lives, which child would sleep down their hall, had been made for them by strangers, for a reason they were not allowed to know. Some of the parents came away feeling less like mothers and fathers and more like links in someone else's chain. And they did not yet know the half of what that chain was for. They had dodged something. And to understand what, you have to go back before the boys were even born, to a woman who wrote a rule that decided the shape of their entire childhoods. Her name was Viola Bernard, and she was a psychiatrist at Columbia. And she was the consulting expert for Louise Wise. Back in the 1950s, years before these triplets existed, Bernard had formed a strong opinion about adopted twins. She believed that identical siblings would grow into healthier, more distinct individuals if they were raised apart, each one given the room to become his own person, without a double in the next bed. She also argued that placing multiples in a single home put a heavy burden on adoptive parents, which in her view made twins and triplets harder to place at all. So she helped set a policy at the agency. When identical multiples came through, they would be separated, quietly, and placed in different families as if they were only children. It is worth saying plainly that this was never settled science, even at the time. The idea that you do a set of twins a favor by pulling them apart cut hard against what child psychologists were already learning about attachment, about how deeply young siblings bond, and how much that bond gives them. Plenty of experts of that era would have been appalled by the policy if they had known it was running. Bernard was not describing a consensus. She was acting on a conviction, a personal theory about identity and independence, and she had been handed exactly the seat where a personal theory could be turned into other people's lives. An agency is supposed to protect the specific child in front of it. This one had quietly signed on to a sweeping theory about children in general, and let that theory decide what happened to the actual boys in its care. Sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to skate past. A separation that felt to the parents like a rare and unlucky accident was, in fact, the plan. It had been the plan for years. It had a name and an author, and the babies who came through that agency were sorted according to a theory that the adults around them had already decided was true. Now, a separation policy is one thing. It is arguable, it is wrong in hindsight, but you could imagine a well-meaning doctor in 1950 defending it in good faith. What turned a bad policy into something much colder was the man who looked at all these separated children and saw not a placement problem, but an opportunity. His name was Peter Neubauer, and he was a psychoanalyst who ran the Child Development Center in Manhattan, an arm of a large and respected child welfare institution. Neubauer understood exactly what Bernard's policy had created. Somewhere out in the boroughs and the suburbs were sets of genetically identical children, being raised by different families, in different homes, at different rungs of the economic ladder, with none of them knowing the others existed. In the entire history of psychology, no one had ever been able to arrange that on purpose. It would be monstrous to try. And here it was, sitting in an agency's filing cabinets, already done. So Neubauer built a study around it. Starting around 1960 and running for the next 2 decades, his team followed sets of these separated identical siblings through their childhoods, comparing them, measuring them, tracking how the same genes unfolded in different worlds. The triplets were part of it. So were at least 5 sets of identical twins, according to the fullest account we have, the one assembled by the twin researcher Nancy Segal. The agency had separated more identical children than the study ever formally tracked, but a core group became the subjects, watched year after year. And here is a detail you should hold on to, because it tells you the study was designed, not stumbled into. The families were not chosen at random. The children were deliberately placed across different social classes. One brother went to a working-class home in Queens. One went to a middle-class home on Long Island. One went to a well-off home in Scarsdale, to a father who was a doctor. If you wanted to isolate the effect of environment on identical genes, that is precisely how you would build it. You give them the same genes, drop them into different worlds, and measure the gap that opens between them. And this was not a quick look. The observation ran for years on each child, following the same boys from the crib through grade school, all the way to about age 12. The same team came back again and again, so that what they were building was not a snapshot, but a long, patient record of 2 or 3 identical children growing up on separate tracks. Somewhere in an office, the file on one boy sat in a drawer beside the file on his brother, the 2 lives laid side by side on paper, while the boys themselves never once stood in the same room. The adults holding those folders could compare them any afternoon they pleased. The children in them could not, because the children did not know the drawer existed. There was even federal money in it. The research was funded in part by a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, which means this was not a rogue operation in a basement. It was a study with letterhead and funding and respectable names attached. And here is where it turns genuinely ugly, because this is the thing the families never agreed to. What, exactly, were the parents told? They were told their child had been placed through an agency that ran an ongoing study of child development, and that researchers would like to follow their son's growth over the years. That sounds harmless. Adoptive parents want to do right by a new baby, and a free set of experts checking in on the child's development sounds like a gift. So they said yes. What they were not told is the only thing that mattered. They were not told that their son had an identical brother, or 2. They were not told that the visits had never really been about their child. The visits were about the comparison between their son and a genetic copy of him growing up in a house across the city. As one summary of the study puts it, the parents believed they were raising an only child, and they believed the researchers were simply studying that child. The truth was, underneath both of those sentences, and it was hidden on purpose. And that word, hidden, is the ethical heart of this whole thing. There is a principle at the center of all research on human beings, and it is not complicated. If you are going to study a person, that person, or in the case of a child, the parents, has to know what they are agreeing to, and has to be free to refuse. It is called informed consent. By the 1960s, the modern version of it was already being written into medicine, after the world had seen what happens when doctors decide that certain human subjects do not need to be told anything. The Louise Wise families were never given that choice. They could not consent to a study of separated siblings, because they were never told a study of separated siblings existed. They could not refuse to let their son be compared against his own twin, because they did not know their son had a twin. The consent they signed was consent to a fiction. They had approved a harmless-sounding study of their own child, and that paperwork quietly provided cover for the real one going on behind it. So for years, the researchers came. They came into these living rooms with cameras and clipboards and boxes of tests. They filmed the children at structured tasks. They ran intelligence tests and personality assessments. They asked the parents long questions and wrote down the answers. They tracked milestones, the age each boy walked, talked, read, the way each boy handled frustration, or strangers, or a new toy. The children grew up thinking a friendly researcher visited sometimes, the way some kids grow up with a family doctor who takes an interest. They had no idea they were 1/2 or 1/3 of a measurement. And crucially, the study was arranged so that the data on one twin could be compared against the other without either child ever appearing in the other's file or the other's life. That wall between the brothers was a deliberate condition of the experiment, not a byproduct of how adoption works. Now, go back to the reunion with all of that in your head, because the meaning of it just turned inside out. The public saw 3 brothers beating impossible odds to find each other and called it a miracle. But it was not a miracle. It was a breach. Those 3 boys were never supposed to meet. Those impossibly long odds had not come from nowhere. Someone had separated the brothers on purpose, kept them apart on purpose, and was, in a real sense, still watching. And every single thing the talk show audiences had cooed over, the identical laugh, the identical cigarettes, the identical gestures, was the study performing itself. All of it was data, the exact material the researchers had spent years collecting in private, now playing out live on national television for free. The reunion the country treated as a happy ending was the moment the experiment lost control of its own subjects. And it gets worse when you realize what the brothers themselves had been feeling all along, because the sameness went past cigarettes. When the 3 of them finally compared childhoods, they found that all 3 had struggled in similar ways as kids. All 3 reported periods of real difficulty growing up. Whatever the study was following, it was not the development of 3 happy, untroubled boys. Each of them had carried something heavy through childhood, separately, in 3 different homes. And no one had ever told any of them that there were 2 other boys out there carrying the same face, and, it seemed, some of the same weight. There is a darker possibility that hangs over this part, and honesty means naming it carefully, because it has never been proven. Some critics of the study have noted that the triplets' birth mother was reported to have had a history of mental illness, and they have asked an uncomfortable question. Did the researchers know that, and did they select these particular children from birth families with psychiatric histories, precisely so they could watch whether mental illness surfaced across identical siblings raised in different homes? If that were ever shown to be true, it would mean the children were marked as subjects before they were even placed, and that the adoptive parents were kept in the dark about their own son's medical background on purpose. The sealed files might settle it. Nobody outside the study can, which is exactly where the most disturbing questions in this story keep landing, on the far side of a locked door. The bond, when it finally came, was overwhelming, and it came under a spotlight, and it came far too late. You cannot hand 3 19-year-olds the childhood they should have had together. You can only give them the strange, intense, complicated adulthood of trying to become brothers in public, all at once, with cameras running. For a while, the sheer joy of it carried them. But 3 grown men who missed their entire shared childhood, thrown together into fame, and then into business together, began to strain. The restaurant caused friction. The closeness that had felt like destiny started to fray under ordinary pressures, made heavier by everything underneath. Bobby eventually stepped away from the restaurant. The brothers had conflicts, the kind any siblings have, except these siblings had no years of practice, no shared history to fall back on, nothing but the shock of the same face. And then, in 1995, Eddy Galland died. He had lived with mental illness, and he had been hospitalized for it, and he took his own life. He was 34 years old. I want to be careful here, because this is where a story like this one gets tempting to abuse, and I am not going to do that. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to stand over that grave and announce that the study killed him. Nobody can prove that. Mental illness is its own force, and it takes people from every kind of family, including families that were never touched by any experiment. What is true, and what the surviving brothers have said, is that they were left with an unbearable question they can never answer. Would it have gone differently if these three had grown up in the same house, knowing each other, instead of being kept apart and quietly observed by strangers with clipboards? Nobody gets to know. That is part of the cruelty. The people who ran the study took the one variable that might have helped, the brothers themselves, and turned it into a thing to be measured rather than a thing to be lived, and then they kept the results. Because that is the other cost, the one that outlives everyone involved. The study was never published. Peter Neubauer, in all the years he had, never released his findings, never wrote the big book the whole thing seemed built to produce. Think about what that means. Researchers took the childhoods of these children, watched them, tested them, filmed them, compared them, and then produced nothing the public could see. The subjects had handed over their entire childhoods to this study, and they were never even given the truth about themselves in return. And science received nothing either, which is its own kind of absurd. If you genuinely believed, as Neubauer seemed to, that this was a rare and precious window into human development, then the one thing you owed the world was the finding. You would publish, you would let other researchers check your work, you would let the knowledge justify, at least a little, what it had cost. He did none of that. The observations went in, and nothing ever came back out. No paper, no answer, no lesson anyone else could use. Whatever those years of watching were worth, the worth went into a drawer and stayed there, useful to no one, least of all the children it was taken from. And when the study finally wound down, quietly, around 1980, the records did not go into the world. They went into the dark. In 1990, the study's records were handed to Yale University and locked away as a sealed collection in the university's archives. The seal was not set for a year or for a decade. It runs until the 25th of October, in the year 2065. 75 years, a stretch of time carefully chosen to outlast the lifetimes of nearly everyone who was in it. The men whose childhoods fill those boxes will almost certainly be dead before any stranger is allowed to read what was written about them. And the terms of the seal were not set by Yale. They were set by the institution that ran the study, which kept for itself the power to approve or deny who gets in. For the entire 75 years. Ask who a seal like that actually protects. It does not protect the subjects. The subjects are the ones pleading to see it. It does not protect the public, which has a plain interest in knowing how a federally funded study treated a group of children. A 75-year seal protects the study. It shields the names and the reputations of the people who designed it, and the institutions that housed it and paid for it, by making sure no reckoning can happen while any of them are still alive to answer for it. By the time the boxes open in the year 2065, everyone who built the thing will be long gone. Past questions, past consequences. That is not a filing decision. It reads like the final move of the experiment itself, the step that guarantees no one ever has to explain it out loud. Some of the subjects have fought their way to fragments of it. After years of pressure, and after the cameras came back around for a documentary, some of them, including Shafran and Kellman, were finally handed portions of their own files. More than 10,000 pages. And here is what a sealed truth looks like, when they finally let you hold it. Page after page of it was blacked out. Whole sections redacted into uselessness. One subject described receiving hundreds of pages that were mostly just black. The people in the files were handed their own childhoods with the words scratched out. They know a study happened to them. They still do not fully know what it found, or what it decided they were. The truth surfaced, the way these things usually do. Not through the people who owed it, but through the people who went looking. A journalist named Lawrence Wright dug into the separated twins story in the 1990s and put real reporting behind it, and pressed Neubauer directly. Years later, two women, Elise Schein and Paula Bernstein, discovered on their own that they were identical twins, separated as infants, and realized they had been subjects of the very same study. They reunited in 2004 and wrote a book about it. Their story rhymes with the Triplets in a way that should unsettle anyone. One of those women had simply gone looking for her birth mother, the ordinary search of an adopted adult, and the trail led first not to a mother but to a sister she never knew she had, and then to the discovery that the two of them had been studied as children by a program neither of them remembered agreeing to. Had she never gone looking, she would have lived her whole life knowing neither fact. That is what a well-kept experiment looks like from the inside. For decades, the subjects were the only people walking around who did not know the most basic fact about their own childhoods. And the twin researcher Nancy Segal spent years assembling the fullest account of what was done, published in 2021. Piece by piece, the outline of the thing came into view, dragged into daylight by its own subjects, and the writers who believed them, while the actual records stayed locked in Connecticut. As for Peter Neubauer, he had the chance to reckon with it, and he chose not to. In an interview in 2004, near the end of his life, he defended the work. In his telling, the study had been proper, by the standards of its time, consistent with the adoption practices and the research norms of the era. There is a version of that defense worth taking seriously, and then there is the reason it falls apart. It is true that in the 1950s, the rules around human research were looser, and consent was treated more casually than we would ever accept now. But the study did not end there. It ran all the way into 1980. It ran straight through the exact years when American medicine was rewriting those rules, when informed consent hardened from a polite ideal into a firm requirement, when review boards were created for the specific purpose of stopping researchers from doing things to people without telling them. Neubauer had 2 full decades to look at what his study was and to face the fact that the ground had moved under it. He kept collecting, and then he kept it sealed. The standards of the time caught up with the study while it was still running. He simply chose not to notice. He did not apologize. He died in 2008, having never published the findings and never taken back a word. The records outlived him, still sealed, and so did his silence. So let us go back one last time, to that college hallway in 1980, to a young man being greeted by strangers who were sure they knew his face. The country decided that the triplets had settled the oldest question in psychology. 3 men, 1 face, raised apart, turning out so alike. Nature wins, genes are destiny. It made a wonderful headline, but it was never that simple, and the people best positioned to know how simple it was are the ones who locked the evidence away. Yes, the brothers shared a laugh and 100 small gestures. They were also 3 distinct men, marked in different directions by the different families that raised them, by fathers who were present or distant, by houses that were warm or strained. That mixture, the sameness and the difference, living together in 3 real people, is the actual answer, and it is far more interesting than the tidy headline the country wanted. But the measurements that would let anyone state it with any precision are the very pages blacked out and boxed up in Connecticut. And we do not get to have them, because the men who collected them decided we could not. This is the thing worth carrying out of the story. Some of what we casually believe about nature and nurture, about how much of a person is written at birth, was learned from children who were never asked to be part of any experiment. 3 of those children were brothers who found each other by accident in a hallway and spent the rest of their lives trying to understand why they had been kept apart and reaching for an answer that had already been written down about them and then buried in a box with a date on it they will not live to see. Strangers once recognized their face on the wrong person and could not say why. The people who could say why wrote it all down and sealed it and walked away. If you want to sit with the quieter, stranger stories underneath the famous ones, the studies nobody was supposed to find, and the records still waiting in the dark, stay with us. There are more of these than anyone would like to admit.